We used to be concerned that a terrestrial conflict might extend into space. A conflict like that on Earth will begin in space because China will see it as a means of leveling the playing field and enabling their ability to proceed with a terrestrial military action.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week I have the privilege of sitting down with the CEO of ULA, United Launch Alliance, which is responsible for the vast majority of national security space launches. And Tory Bruno has been at the helm for 11 years, has done a phenomenal job navigating interesting times, interesting environments, but continues to lead the way on a significant set of issues facing our country today and tomorrow. We're going to have a brief discussion about ULA, but also conflict in space, what we're seeing there, what the implications are as a warfighting domain, but also as a domain in itself, and where we go from here. So, Tory, thank you so much for joining us today.
Frank, happy to do it.
So I thought we'd start with, basically, I think that many of our viewers and listeners will be familiar with ULA, but probably not in the depth that is probably worth getting into. So let's start with the softball, and that is, what is ULA? What are some of the activities you're engaged in, and what keeps you excited every day?
Sure. Well, we're one of the nation's two heavy lift space launch providers. And as you pointed out, we've put up about 90% of the current national security space infrastructure that is in orbit. We specialize in the most exotic orbits, the ones that are almost always unique to the government. But we've also done a lot of exploration work. We have launched all 20 U.S. missions to Mars, a Parker solar probe. We sent Perseverance to Mars with the helicopter, that sort of stuff. Vehicle is big. It's a 23-story high rocket. It is different than other rockets. I'll share that when you're developing a space launch vehicle, especially in that heavy class, you have to make a choice right up front in your architecture. Will the rocket most often finish its job in LEO, or will it most often fly all the way out to a higher energy orbit? For example, geosynchronous. We have chosen to do that. That's our heritage. That's why most of the infrastructure for national security was put there by us. And as it stands today, we're the last one. The vehicles developed by SpaceX are intended to go to LEO most often. As New Glenn comes on, which will also be good for the country to have that broader industrial base, there'll also be a LEO rocket. And of course, when we go overseas, Ariane is optimized for that LEO delivery. Now, the spacecraft might go further. We're talking about where the rocket is done. Fundamentally changes how the rocket works and what its architecture looks like.
And I might note here, Decatur, Alabama, so near and dear to Auburn University and what have you. I'd be curious. So you were talking about the most exotic. I would also argue probably for some of the most exquisite capabilities the U.S. government has. And success is paramount. So thoughts in terms of the mission itself and what you think that responsibility entails.
Yeah, well, that's a great question because it is a heavy responsibility and it really affects our culture here at ULA. Yeah, we love rockets. We're rocket people. We're rocket scientists. I've got like 1,200 of them on.
Literally? Yeah.
Literally. But because of that mission, what's always in our mind is that as cool as the rocket is, as much as we love it, it really has no inherent value. We are only here to take that important, life-saving, exquisite payload to its destination, and that's the only thing that matters. You can see it in how we approach our job, the attention to detail we apply, even just watching the live launch forecast. Nobody claps, nobody cheers until the spacecraft successfully separates, because there's nothing to cheer about until that mission is done.
Well said, well said. And anything you want to share in terms of NSSL or the National Security Space Launch? I guess we're at phase 2.0 and 3.0, so congratulations on making the list for both and getting the certifications and what have you. But anything you want to share there in terms of what we're seeing now?
I will. I'll just share a couple things. This summer, we will introduce Vulcan, which has already flown a couple of times to be certified, but we'll be introducing it to National Security Space Launch. So the first Vulcan missions, which will happen this summer, will be for that. It's then going to pivot back and do some launches for our commercial customer, Amazon, with its Kuiper, high-speed internet constellation that we've already started flying. But it'll just be going back and forth between national security and Amazon. I will also share that one of the special things about the rocket is the upper stage. Really the longest duration, most accurate upper stage in the planet. So we're also very, very proud that when we deliver those national security space payloads, we hit pretty much a bullseye every time. They get far more accuracy than they contracted for, and that translates into the spacecraft both lasting longer and performing at a higher degree because of that.
And the margins of error are they're teeny here, right? So it's a massive engineering feat. And,
yeah, it's crazy. It's like it would be like teeing off in New York City and sinking a hole in one in San Diego.
Boom. Well, I can't golf, so but yeah, that's pretty impressive. Before jumping into sort of the space conflict domain, you've also been at the helm with a lot of change and a lot of disruption. I mean, 20 years ago, it was a very, very, very different world than it is today. And dare I say, you've navigated that very effectively. Do you feel that competition is healthy for the space? No pun intended.
Absolutely. Whenever there is more than one company who has the technical capability to service a critical market, and there's enough market to support more than one, it is a good thing. Competition is, of course, good for the buyer because people are striving to give them the best value at the lowest cost. But the other thing it does is just really, really important in this kind of environment. And with the challenges you've alluded to that the country faces from adversaries like China, is it allows you to drive investment in new technology and innovation. Because when you have no competition, you'll take care of your customer, but it's very, very hard to invest a lot of money in technology if that investment doesn't change your outlook as a business. It's that competition that really spurs that along. So it's super healthy for the customer, really, really healthy for the industry.
And dare I say, SpaceX, Blue Origin, do you see others around over the horizon?
Well, I think there'll be a couple of more providers, but there's probably only going to be market for 3 heavy class launch vehicles in the next decade or two. I think there will be room for 1 or 2 micro launchers, we call them. So those are the very small launch vehicles that are currently flying from folks like Firefly, Relativity, and of course Rocket Lab. And I think 1 or 2 of those will make it to the other side.
10-4 on that. Well, thank you. Let's go to conflict in space. And I think you've been very forward-leaning and outspoken, and I say you do this at the same time that you're hearing the commander of Space Command, you're hearing Space Force, you're hearing a number of 4-stars talk about space in a way that historically we would have all gotten in a whole lot of trouble. We'd be wearing Auburn orange, but now it seems to be part of the discussion, in part because we're seeing our adversaries flex and demonstrate capabilities, and obviously we need to be in a position where we can dissuade, deter, and if need be, compel. Tell me, paint your landscape of where you see space, both as a battlefield, but also the national security equities that are in play here. Everything from PNT to the birds themselves.
Sure, you bet. I'll start with remarking on what you began with as well. It does feel odd sometimes to be talking about these things, but that was a deliberate choice on the part of the Space Force and the national leadership because it has become so critical and it will require the best efforts and best minds of our country to contend with. And therefore, we need for people to be aware of it. So I applaud them for the courage of making that choice. Now, having said that, I think it's important to understand that the role of space for us in conflict and deterring conflict has changed fundamentally over the last 10 years. We used to think about space as a force multiplier for the United States, something that made our troops more survivable, more effective, more lethal. And that's just not true anymore. It's not a force multiplier. It is now absolutely essential for basic military operations. So it's not something that is, in a way, optional that makes us better. We can't live without it. And China and Russia, but especially China, know that. That's why they have been investing so heavily in anti-satellite weapons. It's why we have seen the posture they have taken in acquiring our intellectual property to help them do that. And it's why they're actually fielding those anti-satellite weapons right now. And go ahead.
No, please, please, please.
Well, and the difference that we also see across that spectrum is we used to be concerned that a terrestrial conflict might extend into space. So let's say there's an issue in the Pacific, or there's an issue with China attempting to acquire Taiwan by force, or something the Russians might do. And perhaps the conflict heats up and it would escalate and involve space, which would harm us in a number of ways. I don't believe that's true anymore either. A conflict like that on Earth will begin in space.
Wow.
Because China will see it as a means of leveling the playing field and enabling their ability to proceed with a terrestrial military action.
Well said. And I think it gets lost on people that our entire, not only our national security equities, but our entire economy is dependent upon space, whether it's PNT or precision nav timing, clocks. You mess around with clocks, you can rule the world. And these are the sorts of things that I'm not sure the average American thinks about every day. But to move a product from A to B, to move troops from A to B, to move personnel, it is all not a luxury, but it's dependent upon space, and space being, so it is its own domain, but it transcends every other domain of land, sea, cyber in that case, right?
Yes, and Frank, that's really well said, and I'm glad you raised that point, because it's one of the things that I talk about with the Space Force and with policymakers on a regular basis. Don't just think about the military assets in space. There is a role there to prevent economic coercion from our adversaries and to protect commerce in space, because everything you said is true and more. Not only could you not move goods from point A to point B, you can't pay for them.
Yeah.
Agriculture is dependent on space. When we think about the improved yields that just domestic agriculture provides because of GPS, for example, we're feeding probably 800 million people every day across the globe with the improved productivity in agriculture alone. When we are concerned about the potential for climate change, what space does for especially over the ocean transport of goods, which is the dominant consumption of that type of fossil fuel. Again, it's millions of gallons of fossil fuel that is conserved literally every day by the use of space. And so an adversary need not just fight us in space to enable a military action. They can harm our economy or coerce our government for fear of our economy being harmed.
Very, very well said, and something that I think needs to be foot stomped. The dependency and the impact is just so significant to our economy, our national security, and dare I say, our way of life and society writ large. So I just think that gets lost on a lot of people. They think of trips to Mars, they think of the moon, they think of SIGINT satellites. They don't necessarily think about just how dependent we are as modern societies on space. Let's get to the deterrence question there. So I know you've done some good work in this in previous lives as well, but what does a deterrence strategy look like in space? How are our adversaries, clearly the existential threat being the Communist Party of China, but even Ukraine, I mean, even Russia, we saw early on when they invaded Ukraine, Viasat and other demonstrated at least their interest around space. What are our adversaries doing, and how should we be thinking about a deterrent strategy here?
Yeah, also another great topic, because I think when most people hear the word deterrent, they think about the type of classic U.S., Russia, even U.S., Soviet nuclear deterrent environment, which I'm also very, very familiar with, having developed nuclear weapons in a prior life as well. Space will be more complicated, and it will have some flavor of that, not literally the weapons of mass destruction part, but rather also the notion that we need to make our systems less susceptible to an attack in space in order to deter the adversary from investing too much and being too bold. And the other dimension that's interesting about deterrence in space is flipping back to what we said earlier. Remember, we made the case that a terrestrial conflict, invasion of Taiwan, for example, will begin in space because space will be the enabler that emboldens China to take on our Navy, especially, but also our Air Force to invade that island. Well, if they cannot succeed in space and succeed quickly, then they are deterred from that terrestrial attack back here on Earth. So it's kind of like a double leverage point for us. If we can make the assets in space survivable, if we can defend and protect them, then that takes the element of surprise, the initiative away from China, who would open that invasion by attacking space first. So we're getting deterrence in more than one dimension by making the space asset resilient, but also the other half of the strategy, by the way, that we have lacked until now. Our deterrent strategy in space has only been half a strategy. We have sought to make the assets more resilient. And what we have meant when we say that is that they can take an initial attack and kind of operate through it, sort of fight through it, if you will. And that's fine up to a point. You can't let them continue to attack and degrade your assets in space, because eventually they will fall below a threshold of being useful. You've got to be able to make them stop shooting. It seems common sense, but it hasn't been in the strategy. We were literally prohibited from contemplating a counterforce element.
You know, I'm really glad you brought that up, because we have a very similar discussion percolating now in the cyber environment, where we really have lacked a deterrent strategy. Truth is we've been blaming the victim. And yes, we do need to do more in the space environment, survivability, and the cyber environment become more resilient. But the reality is we're never going to induce changes in behavior unless we can impose some cost and consequence on bad behavior. And don't act surprised, the old Einstein quote that nothing's going to change 99% if we keep doing business as usual. So the status quo, I think, has to change. Speaking of space, do you see, obviously peer countries are going to be at the very top of the list, but do you see drive-by capabilities in terms of directed energy, other countries that we're going to be, because I mean, we've seen a lot of jamming, we've seen a lot of counter UAS that has maybe not full space implications, but it does to one extent or another. Do you see other countries percolating here?
I do. This is one of the other things that makes this environment so much more risk intensive. You know, in decades past, we could count on, I'll call it the club for sophisticated capabilities to harm us, especially in space. being pretty small. And I think if you ask the average person, if not on the street, but perhaps in policy today, who do we have to worry about? Well, they'll say Russia and even to a much greater extent, China, and then they'll be done. And what has changed over the last, say, decade and a half or so is there's kind of now a black market where other countries are involved with both China and Russia and each other in sharing these technologies and helping one another acquire capabilities. And it has really lowered the threshold of entry for countries like North Korea and Iran, Syria. There's a list that I won't go into because I don't remember all the details.
I'm not going to ask you to. So yes.
Yeah, so no orange for me either. But let's just say there's about a dozen countries that we now need to be concerned about. They would not necessarily be able to mount the volume of an attack that a China could, but we need to be careful because they might have some similar capabilities that in the past would have been really beyond their reach.
And I'm glad you brought that up because it used to be a very expensive game. The cost for that is dropping, and again, they don't need a dominant role in space. They're just going to look for that disruptive role, which could be very critical to our national security, and both regionally as well as more generally. I'm going to ask you a question that may be unfair. It's one we did a long paper on, and I've been beating the drum for a long time. So, should space be designated a critical infrastructure sector? So, ironically, it hasn't been. It seems like the duh of all does, but the fact that it hasn't been is just hard for me to fathom.
I agree, and you really presented that argument just in the way you had asked one of the earlier questions. You know, the way to think of space now is it's a utility for our economy,
everything,
and our society. Not having space would be like not having water, not having highways and transportation. It absolutely is critical infrastructure as a direct implication to our military operations, but just day-to-day ability to prosecute our economy is completely dependent on space.
Well, I'm happy you said that. We were going to have a spirited debate if not, because it's just really hard to understand how it hasn't been, just given its importance to everything modern society does. Let's transition a little bit to missile defense and Golden Dome, and you have amazing experience also around THAAD, so this isn't a new topic to you, but we recently had Chairman of House Armed Services on this podcast on Cyber Focus, Mike Rogers, and spoke to the significance around Golden Dome and its feasibility, and we had a little discussion around Brilliant Pebbles and sort of the whole Ronald Reagan deterrence discussion as well, which sometimes is more important than the capability itself if it's packaged right. But I'd be curious what your thoughts are there. Obviously, Huntsville, which is near and dear to Auburn, is at the heart of all this. What are you thinking there, and where do you think ULA fits into the discussion?
Sure. Well, I know Mike Rogers really, really well. I have not had an opportunity to talk with him about Golden Dome. I rarely disagree with Mike, so I'm going to go out on a limb.
Good answer.
I hope he agrees with what I'm going to say, but I think Golden Dome is way overdue. I'm a very strong supporter of that, and it's because of what we just said. There are so many countries now that have the ability to reach out and literally attack our homeland that, you know, the Cold War model where we had really a bipolar world and we had, you know, just ourselves and the Soviets, and we could rely pretty heavily on a cost imposition only form of deterrence is not the environment we are in today. When you've got a dozen countries that have a capability to put either a conventional or, God forbid, a weapon of mass destruction on your kid's school, then only having a retaliatory deterrent is insufficient. One of these guys are going to try us on sooner or later, and we better have a defensive capability or we're going to deeply regret it.
Well said, well said. And what sort of core technologies essential to success here?
Yeah, there's. I'll start with what they're for, and then I'll kind of drill down so they're in context.
Please.
So we sort of have two classes of threats that are the most concerning. We have the ballistic missile threat, which we understand very well, and I personally developed systems to counter those. We now also have to face into the maneuvering hypersonic threat as well. And I know there's cruise missiles, but I'll kind of lump all that together. Now, the good news is most of the threat we face right now in the greatest volume is the ballistic missile threat. And the reason that's good news is because we already have exquisite systems that are literally the best in the world at defending against that type of threat. We just need more of them. Today, what we have for defense of the homeland is literally really only the GMD system, and soon its technology upgrade, Next Generation Interceptor. And GMD's really focused on North Korea. And even against Iran, where it has capability, it's not as robust. We need to have that system in greater numbers so that the magazine cannot be emptied by a mass raid or even two of these difficult countries kind of teaming up on us. And we need it located in two more places. Today it's in Alaska, which does a great job for that North Korean approach. We also need an emplacement in the Northeast and one in the South for non-conventional trajectories that would approach us over the southern pole instead of the northern pole. That gives us our top layer. And I should pause and say, whenever we talk about missile defense, we're always going to want to talk about a layered defense. We do that for two reasons. Again, they're shooting at your kid's school. You want more than one shot, because you want a very, very high probability of stopping that threat. But you also want the layers to use different physics and different phenomenology, because otherwise the adversary is tempted to invest heavily in finding the one vulnerability in that one layer. And if he can do that and come through it, then he leaks all the way to the ground. So these are fundamental principles of missile defense. So we've got GMD, NGI covering wide regions of the United States against a ICBM class threat. That's a hit-to-kill interceptor that works only outside the atmosphere. So it's great for intermediate to long-range threats that will always pass through space on their way here. It needs an underlayer. Well, the underlayer is THAAD. THAAD is a wonderful medium and short-range ballistic missile killer, but it also can kill ICBMs just with a smaller defended area. So we would place several THAAD batteries in regions around the country. I would also, whenever I'm placing it to cover a region, think sort of western state size region, I would put it at a major metropolitan area so that it's also a really effective underlay for an ICBM pointed at a city. Complementing that would be Aegis on all three coasts, another very capable system born on a ship. And now we've kind of got that. And what we're missing, that I'll come back to in a moment, is the hypersonic maneuvering glider. But the really good news about that architecture is all those systems exist now and they are in production. We don't have to wait for them to come through development and then begin production and then build up a force structure. We could start filling out a force structure right now. And the president talked about in his announcement wanting to have a capability in 3.5 years. This is really the only way you do that. And fortunately, it addresses the most numerous threat, which is the ballistic missile threat. Next thing we have to deal with is the hypersonic maneuvering
That's
threat.
not so easy, right? Hypersonics is the one that keeps a lot of people I respect up at night.
That's the tough one. And for the purpose of this discussion, I want to really direct our attention to the word maneuver. All these threats are hypersonic. So if I know you know this, but if you're not a rocket person or a missile defense person, you might not realize that all the ballistic missile threats are hypersonic too. It's not the hypersonic part, it's the maneuver part. Because what that word ballistic means is that the threat will follow a predictable trajectory. So somebody launches a long-range ballistic missile against the United States. We pick it up from space with our space-based infrared system SIBRs, also exquisite. That system will tell us, yep, that is a missile. That is not a space launch vehicle. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the kind it is. And this is where it's going to fly. Tell us its trajectory. You call those tracked files. It'll tell
Mm-hmm.
us its flight path and what it's going to hit. So we know we need to defend it. And then we launch an interceptor, and maybe more than one. And it's just like shooting trap, Frank. It's these things are coming in at rocket speed. You're going to intercept them with a rocket because that's the only thing that's
Mm-hmm.
that fast. You're going to aim in front of it and lead your target, and they're going to arrive at the same place. And we do that hit to kill. And if you're curious, I can explain why we do hit to kill and not just a warhead. The problem with the maneuvering threat is it waits till you commit the interceptor, and then it maneuvers out of that battle space or out of that flight path, and you miss it. And it's because of that velocity problem of having to close on the rocket by flying far out with another rocket to hit it. And
Oh, sorry, please.
I was going to say, I know how to solve that one.
No, that's huge, and you may not know this, but the same philosophy, and actually Lockheed was instrumental, is sort of the kill chain concept from missile defense was born out in cyber as well. So, and there has been discussion on how to incorporate cyber into all of that, because I have a hard time differentiating, delineating, and separating EW, cyber, RF, and then everything we discussed here. It's all, we look at the world through our boxes and org charts. Our enemies don't. So at some point, I think we have to look at it a little more holistically. Is that fair?
That is fair, and that's a great point. These are very complex, integrated systems. There's not going to be a magic solution. There's not going to be, we'll drop AI magically into a battle manager and it's fixed.
Exactly.
This is a more complex problem. And, one of the other things that I worked on before were directed energy platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll come back to that maneuvering threat for a moment. The problem is the relative velocity of an interceptor versus that incoming hypersonic threat that doesn't, in this case, does maneuver. We need to change that math and change that physics. And the way you do that is with a speed of light round. Feel free to maneuver. You can't outmaneuver light. From the standpoint of that directed energy platform, I don't care how fast you're going or how many G's you pull in the maneuver, you look like you're standing still. And so we would place that system in space so we could get out of line of sight. So we need that big horizon, 2,000 miles across kind of horizon. And when we see the hypersonic threat and we track it, this is a little bit different problem than what we have optimized SIBRs for, because in that case, because it's going to maneuver maybe more than once, we absolutely have to have continuous custody. So we need a new space-based layer to track it. Space Development Agency has been working on that. That is what they call their tracking layer. And then when we're sure we want to get rid of it, then we apply that directed energy solution and we kill it. You would be surprised at just how fragile a hypersonic glider actually is, and especially on the leeward side, because all the insulation, all the ablative materials are on the windward side. You can't wrap it in that. They'd be too heavy and they'd be impractical. That, unfortunately, is a new development. I worked on directed energy 15 years ago. We put that stuff down to prosecute the global war on terror, and so we lost it. So we have to reconstitute that, develop it, qualify it, build it up its force structure in space. So that's going to take longer than 3 years.
Well said. And for the benefit of our audience, ablative material. So I think I know a little bit in terms of the old nuke environment, but you want to just shed a little bit of light on that?
Yeah, kind of the same. It's kind of the same thing. In when we are talking about really, really aggressive thermal environments like you get at hypersonic velocities flying through the atmosphere, a
Mm-hmm.
simple insulation is rarely adequate. And so we use what we call ablative heat shields. So these are big, thick, solid hunks of carbon or ceramic. They literally burn off on their way in. So some of the thermal insulation that the payload is receiving is literally because the material is burning off and sloughing away, ablating away kind of faster that it can conduct the heat into the base material. So we call those ablatives. And
Love it. A good science lesson there, because but it matters, right? It can't withstand. So
no. Well, and I developed hypersonic lighters before.
it was cool.
Same story, Frank. You'll hear me say this a bunch of times. We almost had this hypersonic lighter working like 18 years ago, and then we set it down and we moved on, and China picked it up, stole the IP, and they've been going ever since.
Yeah,
Now we
yeah.
got
I say sort of in jest, I worry about the day they stop stealing our secrets because they're leapfrogging to the next set of issues. But you're right. We've seen this movie over and over and over and over again, and that's why I think the deterrence discussion is so important. And ultimately, you don't deter things alone. You deter someone behind the clickety clack of the keyboard or an actor behind the technology, and that means we have to have an honest discussion around this. What's acceptable? What's not? What are the bright lines? What are the red lines? And all of that. I think that's going to dominate the next generation of national security policy wonks, and really glad, and hopefully they learn from previous experiences, including the technology you've worked on here.
We hope. And by the way, I'm glad you said that, because that is such an important point. Deterrence exists in the mind of the adversary,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not.
And
It's
if they
not
don't know
your
you're
mind,
doing something, it doesn't matter either, right? Yeah.
Dr. Strangelove. But
Yep.
also,
Yep.
what would deter us doesn't necessarily deter them. And I'll share with you one of the concerns I have relative to a space security environment is that it is a natural, asymmetric, and low-cost thing for Russia to want
Mm-hmm.
to place a nuclear weapon in high LEO orbit as a means of depriving us from space or deterring us from action against them that relies on space. And they will think that that is definitely a viable strategy. I believe they will want to do something like that. But for us, putting a nuclear weapon in space is a giant taboo. And
Mm-hmm.
we almost can't imagine doing it. And we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking they won't imagine doing it either.
Exactly. And let me add to that just a little bit. What could deter Russia may not dissuade or deter China. What deters China may or may not Pakistan or Iran or North Korea or you name it. We really do need to get down to understanding the motivations and the intentions, what they value, and demonstrate our wherewithal when they cross a line that this is unacceptable. But you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. I feel like we've seen that movie as well, and it just doesn't end well. And one thing, I not to make an already complex set of issues even harder, but land-based systems are so critical to space as well, right? So, and that's where I think what is, when I worked for President Bush, I made the case that space should be part of the homeland, and I'm not sure. People looked at me like I had 15 heads, but the reality is it is, or at least the dependence on the homeland is so significant. But land-based systems are critical. I know I'm running out of time, but I want to talk through the future as well. And Yogi Berra once said, "The future ain't what it used to be," and the reality is the only way to predict it is to shape it. What would you like to see from the administration going forward, and what can they learn from this? I love the way you laid out the layered defense strategy, and you literally pulled from THAAD, Aegis, all the systems that are going to be integral here, because it's not one or the other. It's syncing it all up. But what would you like to see from the blue side, the good guys going forward? What would you like to see here?
Yeah, I'd like to see really 3 priorities. I think Golden Dome has got to be top because we're living under the threat of coercion today. So it's late and it's overdue. The second priority is what we've been talking about the whole time. Space is a warfighting domain. We got to get serious about it. We need to be able to have a whole strategy, not half a strategy. And then the final thing is longer term, but just also vitally important. We have allowed our domestic manufacturing industries and capabilities to drift off our soil, to become dependent on China, and to let our own capability atrophy. We've got to bring that back on shore.
Well said, well said. And any words on Decatur, on your workforce there?
I love Decatur. You know, remember when we talked about culture and I said, hey, we feel really connected to our mission and we know that that's what matters, not our rocket. That's just a given when we're doing business in Alabama, when we're in Decatur and Huntsville. Our people understand that without having to have it explained to them.
Tory, you've given us a tour de force. You've covered so much territory, but what I'd like to ask, which I always ask at the end, what questions didn't I ask that I should have?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think you did a really good job, Frank, of covering the waterfront. You know, the only questions I would think of, we'll need another couple of hours or a couple of days to talk about, so I'm going to save those for next time.
I would love that. Thank you for fighting the good fight. Thank you for your leadership for all these years. And your success is the country's success, so onward and upward, and thank you, Tory. Thank you for spending so much time with us, and hopefully this will be the first of many.
Oh, it was my pleasure. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.